Welcome to the Progressive Christian Bible Study. I did not have a lesson last week, so I'm actually taking last week's lesson, which was a precursor for this past Sunday's sermon on Ecclesiastes 3, and I want to use it for this week's lesson. So we're looking at Ecclesiastes Chapter 3 and the issue of time, which is something that I dealt with in my sermon on Sunday, but something that I think is important and has some more juicy elements that we can dig into in a lesson like this. So I want to begin with the first of the three P's, and that is prayer. And it's a prayer from the great Saint Augustine. Dates to about 400 CE. Increase our faith, O God. Give us diligence to learn and understand the gospel. Open our hearts to trust in you. Let our doubts spur us to seek deeper understanding with patience. For you have given us a mind to question, time to grow and mature, and you call us to know, to love, and to serve, even in the midst of uncertainty. Amen. So the topic for this past Sunday's sermon was the good life and time. And the primary text that we looked at was Ecclesiastes 3. But in terms of the second of the three P's, perspective, I want to delve a little more deeply into something that St. Augustine wrote in his book Confessions, which dates to sometime near the end of the 4th century CE. So somewhere in 397 to 400 range, he wrote Confessions. And in book 11, he deals with the topic of time and eternity, which I think gives us an interesting perspective on the issue of time, and in particular, Ecclesiastes Chapter 3. So in Book 11 of Confessions, dealing with time and eternity, Augustine wrestles with how we comprehend time. He says we divide time into three parts: past, present, and future. But, he says, the future doesn't exist because it hasn't arrived yet. And the past also doesn't exist because it's faded into non-existence. So all that leaves us with is the present. But then the question becomes, what is the present? Because as soon as the future arrives, it is experienced as the present. But once it's experienced, it's already become the past and has started to fade into non-existence. So Augustine writes, the present has no space of its own. So if we think of time in terms of past, present, and future, and if the future hasn't arrived and the past has faded, meaning that neither exists, and if they blur together in such a way that the present has no space of its own, then, asks Augustine, what is time? And he replies with a terse, I don't know. Here's what Augustine writes, and part of this is a little dense, but bear with me. So this comes straight from Confessions, Book 11, Chapter 14. I state confidently that I know this, writes Augustine. If nothing were passing away, there would be no past time. And if nothing were coming, there would be no future time. And if nothing existed, there would be no present time. How then can these two kinds of time, the past and the future, be, when the past is no longer and the future as yet hasn't arrived? But if the present were always present and would not pass into the past, it would no longer be time, but eternity. Therefore, if the present, so as to be time, must be so constituted that it passed into the past, how can we say that it is? Since the cause of its being is the fact that it will cease to be. Does it not follow, he says, that it tends towards non-being? So Augustine comes up with a psychological explanation of time that I think is brilliant. He argues that time as such exists only in our minds. It is, therefore, relative. The past, he says, exists in our memories. The present, he says, exists in our intuition, our instinctive feeling in the moment. And the future, he says, exists in our expectation of it. So it's a psychological explanation of time. Time is relative to the individual and the individual's own experiences of it, anticipation of the future, experience in terms of intuition now in the present, and memory of the past. But it's all psychological. It's all happening inside us. It's not something that exists in real time, because in real time, the future doesn't exist, and the past is faded away, and the present is so squished by the crashing together of future and past that the present has no space of its own. So the only way to really explain time, he says, is our psychological experience of it. Now, when it comes to God, Augustine argues that God stands completely outside of time, existing in a kind of eternal present where there is no memory of the past, no experience of the present, and no expectation of the future. All is present for God. Now, there are some complicated aspects of this. In particular, how can God have a will in the moment to make a choice about something that's happening in time if God sees everything as an eternal now? But we don't have to get into that right now. But for Augustine, in a kind of what's called the classical theist perspective, for his understanding of God is that God sees everything as an eternal present. There is no past or future. C.S. Lewis, in his book Mere Christianity, made a similar point, reflecting again this classical theist perspective. So here's what C.S. Lewis said. If you picture time as a straight line along which we have to travel, then you must picture God as the whole page on which the line is drawn. We come to the parts of the line one by one. We have to leave point A behind before we can get to point B. And we cannot reach point C until we leave point B behind. But God, he says, exists outside of this entire process. God sees time as the whole page, you might say. God contains the whole line and sees it all, says C.S. Lewis. Now again, this is the classical theist perspective, the classical theist argument about God's relationship to time. Time for God is an eternal present, an always now type of idea. Now, many of you may be familiar with this, and you may even hold some version of it. It's sort of in the bloodstream of classic Christian tradition, seeing God as this eternal present figure when it comes to time. But there are a couple of problems with this perspective. The first reason why it's problematic is that it is illogical. And by that I mean that if you think about C.S. Lewis's line, it's assuming that the future exists in some way. In order for God to see the whole thing as one eternal present, it assumes that the future exists in some capacity. But strictly speaking, the future does not exist until we make choices that bring that future into the present. So as we continue to make choices in real time, future points on the line become less likely or more likely depending on the choices that we make. So the options narrow down as we make our choices. But those future choices still only exist as possibilities. They don't exist as realities yet. So in a way, it's illogical to say that God sees the future because the future doesn't exist. Another way to think about this is that God can't do the logically impossible. So God can't make 2 + 2 = 5. And in a similar vein, God can't know something that doesn't yet exist. That is, the future in concrete terms. All God can know, all that's logically possible for God to know, are possibilities about the future. And again, as we make choices, those possibilities narrow down, and God has tremendous predictive ability to predict where things might go, but strictly speaking, the future is open. So God can only know possible futures. So that's one problem with the classical theist perspective, the problem of the logic or illogic of a future existing for God to know in some kind of eternal present. But then a second problem is God existing in an eternal now weakens one of the central claims of both Judaism and Christianity. And one of those central claims is God is with us now. So God experiences with us now. In the season of Advent in Christian tradition, we refer to Jesus as Emmanuel, God with us, parenthetically, now. So if everything, past, present, and future, is now to God, then how can God be with us now? Now for God is different than now for us. So neither one of these arguments is fatal to the classical theist perspective, but they do weaken it slightly, this notion that God sees everything as an eternal present. On the one hand, it's problematic because it's illogical, strictly speaking. By that I mean, again, that the future doesn't exist in real terms. It only exists as mere possibility, and that's how God knows it, because God can't know something that doesn't exist. And the other problem is the theological side of it, which is that biblical tradition emphasizes that God is with us now. Well, if now is different for God than it is for us, then how can God be with us now? So this is a nice little excursus on time. Time exists in our minds, says Augustine, as memory of the past, as intuition of the present, as expectation of the future. And then God experiences the flow of time with us. And God accepts the risk of an open future. So that would be a different perspective of God's relationship to time than the classical theist one. So you can kind of do with that as you will. It is an interesting thing to think about. God's so immediately present with us that the future, even for God, only exists as a possibility. And God is constantly taking risks as we live into that future. And God is kind of calling us or wooing us, or in one theological tradition, luring us toward a possible future that God dreams about for us. But God can't make it happen for us. We have to cooperate. Okay, that brings us to the third of the three P's, and that is pieces of Scripture, and it's Ecclesiastes Chapter 3, verses 1 through 13. Again, this is the passage that I preached on this past Sunday, but as we saw with this second P perspective, I've just dealt with a lot more in this lesson than I did in my sermon on Sunday. A lot of interesting stuff, and I'll do the same as we get into the details of this chapter. So again, Ecclesiastes 3, verses 1 through 13. For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to throw away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. What gain have the workers from their toil? I have seen the business that God has given to everyone to be busy with. He has made everything suitable for its time. Moreover, he has put a sense of past and future into their minds, yet they cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I know that there is nothing better for them than to be happy and enjoy themselves as long as they live. Moreover, it is God's gift that all should eat and drink and take pleasure in all their toil. Okay, a few points to note before we dig into the details here. Ecclesiastes, the term, is the Latin transliteration of the Greek rendering of the pen name of the author. In Hebrew, the author self-identifies as Kohelet, which means the teacher in English. So the first verse of Ecclesiastes is the words of the teacher, Kohelet, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Now, tradition holds that this is a reference to Solomon, the supposed wisest man in biblical tradition. Now, it's impossible to know. Pseudepigraphy, which is writing under a pen name or a presumed pen name in antiquity, was a pretty common practice. So it's likely that Kohelet is a name sort of insinuating that it's Solomon, but not actually explicitly making that connection. And it's probably somebody who's writing much later than Solomon's time. By the end of the book, we do get a sense that this writer is more than just a mere king in Israel like Solomon was. This writer seems to be almost a philosopher-teacher type of individual. So in chapter 12 of Ecclesiastes, the writer says, "Besides being wise, the teacher, Kohelet, also taught the people knowledge, weighing and studying and arranging many proverbs." So almost operating there as a philosopher or teacher of the people. If we can't know for sure who the author was, we can't know when this book was written. There are a couple of uses in the book of Persian words, which suggests that this book must have been written sometime during the Persian period, when the Persian Empire ruled over the people of Israel, which dates the book to sometime around 450 BCE. But who can know for sure? Now, in terms of its content, the book wrestles with a single question that's raised in chapter 1. What real value is there for a person in all the gains that they make under the sun? What real value is there in all of this? What's the purpose of all of this? The book raises several pessimistic answers to this question. So, what value is there? What's the purpose? The writer says, there's nothing new under the sun. It's a constant refrain in the book. What has happened is going to happen again. All is futile or vanity. A chasing after the wind is another constant refrain in the book. Kohelet claims to have experienced all that life has to offer, riches and merriment and wine and possessions, all the finer things in life, luxuries. The writer says, I withheld from my eyes nothing they asked for. In chapter 2, the writer writes this. But whether one has all this stuff, whether one is wise or a fool, says Kohelet, the same fate awaits us all, which is death. Naked we entered the world, says the writer, and naked we will leave it. He says that in chapter 5. So, the writer says, I came to view with despair all the gains I had made under the sun. It's all futile. So, what's the purpose of it all? Kohelet comes to the following conclusion. There is nothing worthwhile for a person but to eat and drink and find enjoyment in their toil. This, too, is a constant refrain throughout the book. In fact, it appears in the section that we just read from chapter 3. Basically, enjoy what you have, make meaning in the work that you do, because time is going to catch up with you eventually. So the book definitely has a pessimistic side, but one could say maybe it isn't pessimistic as much as it's realistic. Isn't this reality? That we are all going to share the same fate eventually? So then if we're all going to share the same fate eventually, what should we be about? And for the writer, it's very much about living in the moment, making meaning in the moment, savoring time. Because time is ticking away from us. So that brings us to our text in chapter 3. It is a poetic section in this book. It's 7 verses or 7 paired lines in verses 2 through 8. The number 7 in the Bible is a number of completion. So each line pairs two semantic things, two related things. And as you work your way through this poetry and you get to the end, the sense is that we've hit completion. 7 lines of poetry, all these pairs paired together, we've hit completion, the entirety of human experience. So birth and death, planting and uprooting, killing and healing, ripping down and building up, weeping and laughing, mourning and dancing, making peace and making war, etc., etc. The point is that each of these, listed in 7 complete lines, is meant to convey the idea that this list is the totality of human experience, even though literally it's not, but it's trying to convey that sense of completion. This is all of human experience. We are going to experience these things at some point in time. And notice that every one of these, listed in verses 2 through 8, is something that we either do or something that happens to us in the present moment of experience. The list is not addressing the past, and it's not referring to the future. The idea here is that the list is describing things as we experience them, or things that we experience as they happen or as they present themselves to us. So there is a time for this and there is a time for that. And even if we personally have never engaged in war or killing, just to draw out 2 things from the list, these events are things that some people have encountered or are encountering right now. So again, the list is trying to convey the sense of completion, the entirety of human experience, experienced in the present moment, at some moment in time. One other thing to note here, which I find interesting, and it struck me as I was reading this passage last week. As you're reading through this list of pairs, there could be a pattern here in terms of connection and separation. So each item on the list could be classified as something that connects us or builds up or brings together, or something that separates us or destroys. So it's worth pondering, I think, whether all of human experience can be broken down into either something that brings us together or something that separates us. I think it's worth spending some time reflecting on that. One other thing that I'd like to note about this passage comes in verse 11. Let me just reread it quickly. God has made everything suitable for its time. Moreover, he has put a sense of past and future into their minds. Yet they cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. So that phrase, he has put a sense of past and future into their minds, is literally, he has put eternity in their minds. So one commentator on this passage writes about this phrase, quote, human beings must live with the paradox of knowing the reality that transcends the moment, eternity, but being able to cope only with the moment. So there is this paradox, this awareness of something more outside of time, eternity, and yet only being able to comprehend things in the moment. So this takes us back to the problem of time. The past and the future don't exist, says Augustine, because the past has faded and the future hasn't yet arrived. And the present is such a tiny fraction of an instant that it has no space of its own. The future moves so quickly into the past. In fact, in a way, by the time we're aware of the present, it's already become the past, living in some sense in our memory or as a memory. So the present, says Augustine, is intuition. The past is memory and the future is expectation, and time is perception. And thus it's relative to every person. And here, for the writer of Ecclesiastes, the writer makes the point that one aspect of time does indeed transcend our individual perceptions. We're aware of it, but it exists outside of our perception. It's this sense of eternity. which God, says the writer, has put into our consciousness. It's the sense that our experience in the moment is not all that exists when it comes to time. Which brings me to two writers. One of them is C.S. Lewis, who I'll get to in a moment, but the other one is philosopher Alvin Plantinga, who is a Christian philosopher who wrote a book called Knowledge and Christian Belief. And in that book, he talked about our constant longing for more as human beings. It's the sense that our experiences are pointing beyond themselves to something eternal. So for Plantinga, what I'm about to read here, it's kind of a validation of what Ecclesiastes Chapter 3, verse 11 says, that God has put a sense of eternity into our consciousness or into our minds. And for Plantinga, that translates into the things we experience in the moment are never quite enough. They're pointing beyond themselves to something more. And for Plantinga, they're pointing toward this sense of eternity. So here's what he writes. Consider the haunting, supernal beauty of the prairie on an early morning in the Grand Tetons, or the gleaming splendor of Mount Shukshan and Mount Baker from Skyline Ridge, or the timeless crash and roar of the surf, or the melting sweetness of Mozart's Dona Nobis Pacem, or the incredible beauty and grace and power of an ice skating routine, or of a kickoff return for 98 yards. In each, says Plantinga, there is a kind of yearning, something perhaps a little like nostalgia, or perhaps homesickness, a longing for one knows not what. It's a longing, an unfulfilled passion. When confronted with such beauty, he says, we might feel that there is even more beyond, a more that we yearn for, but can only dimly conceive. This longing, he says, points to something deeper, something beyond us, something eternal. And now to C.S. Lewis, who made a similar point, but in different words. And again, this is his book, Mere Christianity. I'm going to end with this. So it's the same idea here about being aware of something more, something bigger than the present moment. So here's what C.S. Lewis wrote. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was not just made for this world, but made for another world. If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Probably earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy it, but only to arouse it, to suggest the real thing. Okay, next week is Thanksgiving, so we're not going to have a lesson next week, but we'll return during Advent, the first week of December.